Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Valuing Nature webinar, Valuing Nature Natural Capital Account for National Natural Reserves. I'll pass over to Ece, who is going to introduce you.
Yes, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to host our colleagues from Natural England for this Valuing Nature webinar. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website. You will get an email link afterwards. And after a few introductory words from myself, Dr. Ruth Waters, Deputy Chief Scientist of Natural England and also a member of the Valuing Nature's Programme Advisor Group, and Tim Sunderland, Economics Principal Specialist at Natural England, will tell you about their accounts work, and we will go straight into a Q&A session afterwards, wrapping up at 1 o'clock. Please use the chat facility to ask questions throughout the webinar so we can go straight to Q&A, and I will moderate the questions at that time. If we don't have time to cover your question and you wish to contact Tim or Ruth, you're welcome to do so afterwards by email. You'll have the contact details at the end. So let me tell you a few words about the Valuing Nature program. For those of you who might be new to it, it's a 5-year research program funded by these research councils and DEFRA. And the aim is to create an interdisciplinary network and support interdisciplinary projects on particularly human health and well-being, but also on ecosystem stocks and tipping points. There have been 7 projects funded by the program and several networking events. I'm sure some of you attended, and this webinar is one of those. As well as creating an interdisciplinary research network and practice, we involved research users and decision makers, both in public and private sector, from the very beginning of the program, and that's why it's particularly useful to get colleagues working in the policy sphere talking to us today. When the network, this particular program started back in 2014, the term natural capital was not used as frequently as it is today, though there's still some confusion as to what natural capital means and why natural capital approach is different to any other thing that we do in environmental policy and management. There's a summary of what some colleagues and I think is different about natural capital approach, and it is that particularly thinking about the stocks of natural capital encourages us to look at changes in both quality and quantity of assets and flows of benefits we receive from them over the longer time into the future. It encourages us to think about both biotic and abiotic natural resources, and it also encourages us to think not only about impacts of economic activities on the environment, but also the dependencies of those activities on, again, the stocks and flows from the environment. And finally, it encourages us to value the impacts and dependencies, both measure and value. And in the same way as Valuing Nature understands value, it's multiple of values, not just monetary, but also qualitative and quantitative information and different ways of defining and measuring value. And in that particular way, I think that what Tim and Ruth and colleagues have done in this example is particularly useful in presenting us with all the information that goes into valuation, as you will see. A way of bringing all this information, all this what's special about natural capital accounting, approach is indeed accounting, and that's the example we have. And I asked quite a lot of our clients, about 20 of them, as to why they do natural capital accounting, and I'm sure we'll hear from Tim and Ruth. And they said that it gives them a a record of the state of natural capital assets and benefits at a given time, in particular tracking changes over time, changes that they can control, and there are risks and opportunities. In particular, understanding what the implications of those changes are for management decisions and comparing different types of management decisions that they can make. Considering that accounting is not mandatory and probably unlikely to be mandatory at any time soon, we need to make sure that it is useful for decision makers. And on that point, I'll pass the word over to Tim and Ruth to tell us of their experience and their findings. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you, Ece, for that really good introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, good. So good afternoon, everybody. So this is Tim Sunderland here. I'll be presenting jointly with Ruth Waters, who you'll hear in a minute. So many of you will know Natural England, but we're a non-departmental public body. We look after wildlife and landscape in England, work very closely with other agencies in the DEFRA group, such as Environment Agency, Forestry Commission, and Core DEFRA. And you'll know there's been a lot of interest in natural capital accounting. So our organisation was interested. So we set about producing a natural capital account for Natural England. And for us, natural capital accounting is often focused on land assets. And for us, our big land assets are national nature reserves, which are bits of land specially set aside for geodiversity and biodiversity. And so this is what we're doing an account of. We're doing an account of the national nature reserves that Natural England manages. So that's by way of intro. And then there's a bit of a setup about accounting that I'll take you through before we get into the detail, which will be familiar to some, but not everybody. So on the first slide here, this is a classic economics diagram, a way of thinking about different kinds of goods. So some goods only one person can have, and other people can't have them. So those are called rival. So a Mars bar is a rival good, because if I eat it, then you can't have it. And some goods are excludable, which means that if people don't pay, you can stop them having it. So newspapers, that's an excludable good. But things like lampposts, policing, national security, and clean air are all non-excludable kinds of goods. Now that's important because we make many of our decisions based on accounts, particularly business accounts and government accounts. And government and accounts normally only include the private and club goods, so only really the excludable ones. So these are the ones that are traded in markets. So they're important, but there are many other goods that are important that are not traded in markets. So what we're trying to do with natural capital accounting is broaden what we're capturing to include these important goods that are not traded in markets. So on my next slide here, what I'm saying is that we're trying to think about the natural environment in asset terms, which is relatively new, I think. So it's quite common to think about a tractor in asset terms. What benefits does it provide, for how long, how well, what state it's in, what investment and maintenance is required. We'd find that quite natural to do about a tractor. But we want to ask similar questions about national nature reserves. So there's a picture there of Ingleborough, and we want to ask exactly the same questions about national nature reserves. So I'm then going on to think about the purpose of accounts. I'm going on to think about different types of accounts. So as Ece said, natural capital accounting is quite a new area. It's not standardized in the way that traditional accounting is, where there are very clear sets of guidance that organizations follow. And it's still quite an experimental sort of place. So you can do it in two different ways, really. One is you can do it at an area level. So you pick a big area and you do that. So that's what the Office for National Statistics is doing, the ACON workers in that space. Or you could do it very tightly for an organization. So ours is organizationally focused, but we have specifically defined areas, as you'll see, in our national nature reserves. There is a commonly used tool out there called corporate natural capital accounting. We haven't strictly followed that, but we are on the organizational side, really, of that split. And then this is what I was saying before. This is the slide where we talk about what it's for. So what are traditional accounts for? Well, traditional accounts actually have a bunch of different purposes. So there are management accounts. These are internal and they're used to manage the organization. And I think you can set them up pretty much how you like, as long as they're helpful internally and support decision making, which is quite different from external accounts, which organizations produce, which are part of their external accountability and have very specific and tight rules around them. So you could see natural capital accounts possibly falling into both of those categories, but they might look quite different. And natural capital accounts are also being used as part of a communications piece, which is very common with environmental economics, really just to draw people's attention to the significance of the benefits that are being provided by the natural environment, and also the significance of the non-market benefits. So that's a valid use too. But it's important to think about these different uses because they would take you in quite different directions in terms of how you produce the accounts at times. So I'm going to my next slide. And some of the versions of natural capital accounts I've seen, and not all of them actually, but some of them, present the final economic values as the answer to the sum. So that's in the results section. And the earlier stuff is in the report, but it's relegated to the workings. And that is okay, but it's only okay if the value that you're presenting as the final result captures either all or the vast majority of the true value. But as you'll see as we go through our report, and our example is not atypical, because we don't fully understand and can't fully quantify all of the assets, services and benefits, the economic value that you can capture is actually quite partial. And so with our approach, we've really wanted to present everything that we know, really, to give a broader perspective of what the full value would be and represent what we can value as a part of that. So this gets to my three big worries about natural capital accounting. So one is, I've said that already, that they can offer a partial picture of environmental value depending on how they're presented. You can lose sight of the state of the underlying asset. So what natural capital accounting should be really good for and could be really good for is not just thinking about ecosystem services, which we've done for a while, but thinking about the state of the underlying assets and how that's changing. But if we rely on data or assumptions that don't connect to the state of the underlying asset, they won't do that. And that would be particularly concerning if people thought that the account was doing that and it wasn't. So transparency about what the account's actually doing is really very critical there. I hope that made sense. I'm happy to pick that up in questions. And then the other thing is accounts have rarely stated confidence levels in findings, but the level of confidence, it can be very different from one number to another. And it's really important for decision makers to understand that in order to make sense of what the accounts are telling them. So we have attempted to be as transparent as we can and to bring all those uncertainties right up front into the final summary table, as you'll see later. So I'm just going to move the slide on now and pass over to Ruth, who's going to talk us through the logic chain we're using for all our natural capital accounts work. And then Ruth, you'll need to tell me when you want to move the slides on.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Okay, so this is a simplified picture of how we're viewing ecosystem assets, services, benefits and values. So effectively, as a logic chain, moving from left, so you have your asset, which in Natural England we're using broad habitat types as our assets. They enable a flow of a range of ecosystem services that people benefit from and that we value. And there's pressures and drivers of change that influence that flow of services. There's management interventions across all parts of that logic train. And there's also other capital inputs that enable those flows of services, benefits and values. But on the left-hand side in the ecosystem asset box, we're really interested in the quantity of the asset that we have, its quality, because that varies the amount of service flow we get, and also critically where it's located is a particularly important part of this logic chain. So moving on, Tim, please. So this is another kind of diagram trying to illustrate that point with a bit more detail on it. If you look at the roots of the tree, that's your asset, and we've actually identified 7 core areas of quality that we're particularly interested in, which helps to define whether that asset is in good quality or not. And that is something about the hydrology and the geomorphology of the asset, the soils and the sediment, the geodiversity, cultural aspects of the asset, nutrients and chemical status, vegetation, structure and function, and species composition. And so underneath those, there's a great deal of more detail, but they're the kind of broad categories of quality that are really important alongside extent in terms of that asset being able to produce services to people. And again, just to remind you that we view assets as broad habitats. And then the services flow into the branches of the tree where you get your benefits. And again, we can value these both in monetary and non-monetary terms. Next slide, please, Tim. So it's that system on which we've based these accounts. And Natural England has been focused on embedding natural capital into decision making for some time. And we found that to be able to enable that to happen, we needed to be able to measure change in our natural environment so that we can measure the consequences of any of our decisions and interventions. And when we looked around, there were so many different indicators and data sets used to try and get at measuring change in natural capital. We felt we needed to take a step back and do a review. What is it that we should really be trying to measure about the natural capital that we are most interested in? So we used the logic chain that I showed you earlier, and we asked questions across a whole range of different broad habitats, the 8 broad habitats, and associated those with 17 different ecosystem services. And for each of those boxes, we said, what is the key thing we should know about to enable these assets to continue to provide services, benefits and values for people into the future? And we did this with a range of Natural England specialists, Environment Agency specialists. So it's 88 people who took part in this. We got to 50 detailed logic chains, going from an asset to a service, the benefits and value. And we also quality assured this. Once we'd done this process of saying what are the ideal indicators, we then went and had a look and said, okay, if they're ideal, what real data is out there that we can use to do this? And many of you who've worked in this area will know that often the data that we actually have that's regularly collected that we can use to measure change is often not exactly what we want. But we do at least understand which data sets are the best because we now understand what we're looking for, and we also understand how much of a proxy they are. So we're not just using them willy-nilly because it's the only thing available. We understand the benefits or the disbenefits from those different data sets, and so understand a lot more about what it's telling us. We also then were able to say what are the gaps in the data, what is it we need to be looking at filling for future decision making. And if you're interested in this work, you can find it in further detail in a report on Natural England's publication page. Next slide, please, Tim. So that work, that indicator work I've just described, was critical because we then wanted to use those indicators and data to measure change in our accounts. And again, we're looking for our accounts to mirror the logic chain so that we've actually got information about our physical account of the assets. We've, in this case, looked at their extent and their quality, and we've looked at those quality headline attributes that I described earlier. We've then looked to quantify ecosystem services that flow from those assets, the benefits and the values, and have those all together up front so that people can use them effectively in decision making. And as Tim said earlier, you know, often what we find is that the bits we can actually value at the end is only quite small and often quite partial. So the information about the assets themselves also acts as an early warning system where you can see that, you know, if there's an issue with your quality or quantity of your asset, you know, in due course it will probably impact on your value. So it's really important to have those both for decision makers. Next slide, please, Tim. So in our method, we considered National Nature Reserve that Natural England manages. The tenure is quite complicated around National Nature Reserves. You know, within one National Nature Reserve, you might have some that Natural England owns, some that we lease, and so on. So we felt that the sites that we manage was probably the best way to cut this data, because that's the way we can have influence over the site into the future. We collected information on the extent, the quantity and quality of the assets across these 141 national nature reserves. We quantified the ecosystem services and benefits where at all possible. And where we weren't able to, we scored the benefits and ecosystem services using expert judgment, and we'll show you a bit more about that later. And then, of course, we valued the benefits wherever possible. And we expressed confidence limits, as Tim said earlier, to address one of his 3 concerns through a process of a RAG rating. Next slide, please, Tim. Over to you, I think.
Thank you. So it's a big concern to me that accounting hasn't always represented the confidence clearly to the decision maker. It would have been in the report, but you don't have to dig through to work it out. And so what we've done with the numbers where we can is we've offered a RAG rating. So the green ones are fairly uncontroversial. We're not saying that they're right to the last penny, but they're fairly uncontroversial. The amber ones, we've said accuracy is better than. So if we said it's 1, we're actually saying it's between 0.5 and 1.5, for example. And with the red ones, we said order of magnitude. So it could be 10 times bigger or 10 times smaller. Now, if you've got that level of uncertainty in the numbers, I think you'll agree it's very important to represent that to decision makers. And beyond that red level, we haven't quantified it. We've just described it qualitatively. That's useful for the decision makers. It also makes me feel comfortable about really having a go at valuing whatever we can, because I know that we're going to represent the uncertainty to the decision maker. So we won't be guilty of misleading people if we are doing our best to value whatever we can. So I'm now going to move over to the results section. Most of that is going to be about benefits, but we also looked at the cost of running the NNRs. And as those of you who've been around in this sector for a while will know, generally we get a very partial handle on the benefits, but we can get the costs completely. And that is pretty much the case here. So we think our estimate is about 14 million a year to run the NNRs that Natural England manages. And some of that is staff costs and running capital costs. That's quite easy to get hold of. And so that's green. But there's also apportioning a percentage of Natural England's general overhead costs to NNRs, and that's a little less certain. So that's why we get to an amber rating altogether for that 14 million. I'm then going to move over onto the results page. Now, this is the main results page for benefits. There's a lot of detail on here, and we will talk you through it as we go through the next section. So you don't need to understand it all here, but this is just so you can see what we've been talking about. We would determine that this on the final report would be on a double page spread rather than on separate pages, so that you see it all together. Because seeing the benefits and values in the context of the assets and the services is really important, rather than treating those as something separate. So you can see here that we have put this significance rating on both the services and the benefits. That's the orange column there, and that is between 3 and 0. So if there was nothing, we would put 0, no impact at all. 3 is the bigger ones, but we'll talk you through that in more detail in a moment. I'm going to hand back over to Ruth, who's going to talk you through some of the mapping we did. So I haven't mentioned that so far. But a lot of this work was mapping natural capital indicators, and a colleague from Natural England called Kat Hudson did much of that geographical information work. So over to you, Ruth, for this one.
Thank you. Yeah, so here we have a map of all the national nature reserves that we included in this account. So there's more national nature reserves than this, but as I said, these are the ones that Natural England manages. And as Tim said, Kat Hudson was absolutely brilliant in Natural England helping us to sort through all the different data sets that we had around the assets and their quality to try and work out which ones were the best at describing the quality of our natural capital assets in our national nature reserves. So I'm just going to take you through a few of the maps to illustrate some of this work, but there's a lot more detail in our full accounting report. So if you wanted to go away and find out more about exactly what was done and how the analysis was done and the range of data sets we looked at, you can go to the full report. So if you take to the next slide, please, Tim. So one of the first bits we wanted to do was to look at the extent of our national nature reserves, and we wanted to look at the extent of the 8 broad habitat types within those. So this is what we did. So for each of those 141 national nature reserves, Kat went away and using land cover map, assigned the land parcels to these different broad habitat types, and then obviously summed it together for the whole 141. And here's just an example of the lizard NNR in its different broad habitat types. So this is how we got the extent data, which is in the first bit of the full balance sheet that Tim just showed you. Next one, please, Tim. And then, in terms of the quality of the assets, we tried really hard here, and actually we did get data sets across 6 of the 7 quality attributes that we identified in our indicator project. And, we really wanted to try and use open data, and we also wanted to use data that was regularly repeated, and we struggled for some of these. And so I'm just going to show you some of the data sets that we have used. And when you look at the final balance sheet, what you'll see is a kind of column of figures that describes various different bits that have been mapped in this process, and it acts effectively as a baseline. So when we repeat these accounts in 4 or 5 years' time, we can see how the quality of our assets within the NNRs have actually changed compared to the baseline that we currently have. So in terms of the hydrology, we used Water Framework Directive information. We explored several of the data sets within that, and this map shows you the overall status classification for water bodies that we used. For some of the cultural aspects, we used the tranquility data set, and you can see Morehouse here, which is very tranquil. Those of you who have been up there will understand why, because it's in the middle of nowhere, but extremely tranquil, and we use scores across the different NNRs based on the tranquility data set. And for a nutrient and chemical status, we've got maps of average nitrogen deposition, which is the map on the right hand side, which we assign to the different NNRs depending on the data sets for that. Next slide, please, Tim. So in this one, for soils, we've got soil organic carbon in the top left that we used across the different sites. In terms of vegetation, structure and function, we used actually the condition of sites of special scientific interest as a way of getting at that data. And for species, we've actually used average nectar plant diversity for bees. So this is something that we developed with CEH when we were mapping natural capital, which is a mean estimate of the number of species per 2x2 plot. So this has then been assigned across the different national nature reserves. Next slide, please, Tim. So
go on.
Those maps were and a number of other ones were what we used to assign quality and quantity to our first column in our balance sheet. And this is the ecosystem service table. So alongside the asset, this is the service table, and we quantified services where possible, and you can see where we've been able to do that around sale of timber, carbon, number of recreational visits and volunteering hours, and educational visits. But there are also a whole range of services which we were unable to quantify for our National Nature Reserve. So this is where we took expert opinion and assigned a significance rating of the NNRs in contributing to these particular services. So it's not a significance of the service itself, it's the significance of the National Nature Reserve suite that we're looking at in providing this service, and this was scored using expert opinion, with the bolder colours being the most important. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you. And then this is just the right hand side then of that double page spread. So you can see, as before, we've done a significance rating, and we've coloured that in quite strongly on purpose because we want to draw your attention to what we think are the really big benefits of the NNRs, and some of those we've been able to value and some of them we haven't. So cultural well-being, equitable climate, for example, are big benefits that we have been able to put a value on. But biodiversity, we couldn't find a convincing way of doing that, but we think it is a very important benefit of the NNR. So we've rated that as a 3. Then it tells you what the indicator is, and then we've estimated the annual benefit there. So there are some small annual benefits at the top, which come straight off the accounts. So they're market values. So they're green, they're fairly accurate, but they're quite small. The big benefits are down towards the bottom of the page, as you can see. In terms of the big benefits, in terms of what we could value, to be clear, that's a climate one and the cultural well-being ones. Climate was working out the carbon is difficult, but once you've done that, those of you will know the valuation's straightforward following government guidance. And then we were able to come up with estimates as well on recreational visits and volunteer hours. So those are the big drivers there. When you add them up, you get about 36 million a year in annual benefits, just from our very partial estimate. We've also done an asset value calculation, and because of the way carbon benefits increase into the future on the government guidelines, the carbon then becomes the biggest one in terms of the asset value. But those are red rated, so they could be 10 times larger or 10 times smaller, we think, but nevertheless a very significant benefit there. So it's a very partial estimate, but even on that basis, the 36 million in annual benefits compares quite well compared to the total cost of 14 million, and the costs are complete, really. So I'm just going to pass you on to our last slide here, because this was a largely in-house project. Ruth and I have presented, but Jane Lasardi, Natural England, and Kat Hudson, who we mentioned already, and Dan Marsh of Waikato University in New Zealand were also authors. So I want to thank them at this point, and also thank Valuing Nature Programme for hosting the webinar for us. And then I will pass back to Ece.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ruth. I haven't received any written questions here, but if anybody now is ready to ask one, either by typing or maybe I think you can raise your hand, and Victoria could give you the phone, the microphone, sorry, and you could ask questions. Does anybody want to ask anything? If not, I can ask a couple. Cool. Well, let me start whilst maybe some people are typing. You talked about very rightly taking account of condition and extent of the assets and what's changing over time. And I might have missed this while you were presenting, but what kind of assumptions you made to sort of how the baseline is going to change over time, and over what time period did you account for in the results? So you mentioned the carbon, obviously price changing.
Yeah.
But about the quantities.
Well, I'll go first, and then Ruth might want to come in. But I think that's why I highlighted that it wasn't corporate natural capital accounting, because we don't know what's going to happen to the benefits into the future. And we didn't have any convincing method of projecting that. So and for that reason, I would have been content just to offer annual values, but there was an enthusiasm to have asset values. So the asset values are based on a flat projection into the future, assuming that everything stays the same, which is not necessarily what we think will happen, but given the lack of any other projections, that seems the best way to do the asset values.
Cool. Okay. Now I can see. Thank you. I can see a question from Matt Hayward, and he's asking if there are any values put on value of access and health benefits for users.
So we didn't explicitly value health, although we think that it would be important for health, because we'd already valued recreation. So I think we were a bit concerned about double counting there. So the people volunteering and people visiting went under the cultural well-being bucket for this report, but we do think it would have important impacts in terms of health. Probably most importantly, either for people that visited fairly regularly or for the volunteers. And one of the reasons we were cautious about health claims is that some visitors for NNRs, it's quite a special trip rather than a weekly or daily occurrence.
Yeah, Tim, I think to add to that, it's a good question. I think, going through the process of doing this, we're not presenting this as a kind of perfect account in any way. I think what it did flag very much to us was, different forms of data that would be really useful for us to collect from our national nature reserves going forward, so that when we repeat this, we have, collected the data in the right way that we can answer some of the specific questions for some of the services and benefit boxes that we have in the accounts. And a lot of the way that we collect data at the moment, doesn't lend itself very simply to popping it into one box. As Tim said, often it relates to several boxes. So we are working with our National Nature Reserve managers to think about how we might sort of add some data into their existing management systems, so that next time we do this, it will be much easier to quantify some more of those boxes.
Cool. There are a few questions about the input data that you used, and I'm just trying to sort of summarize them without calling on to the askers, because there are quite a few of them. One of them is whether the data sets you used are freely available. For example, the nectar plant diversity data set, and about the transferability of your both physical data and unit values on valuation beyond the NNRs.
Okay, so just on the nectar plant diversity, yes, the maps that the natural capital mapping work that we did with CEH is all freely available online. So you can search for that on gov.uk through Natural England's publication pages. And there's a range of other maps as well. And it's based on some modelling of derived data, but it's sort of the best that we had, the best available that we had. I suppose the advantage of doing some of the asset-based work on national nature reserves is we do have more data. So they are predominantly sites of special scientific interest. So we have more data through that route, and the methodology is completely transferable, outside of national nature reserves. But we just might find that some of the data sets might not be available. But the general principle was that we did try and use open data sets. I mean, the one that's not completely openly available and that the public would have to pay for is actually some of the land cover map data, which is from CEH. But Natural England we can use that information. But we chose that data set because it covered all of England, and we didn't really have an alternative ready at hand, which would cover the whole of England in a sort of systematic way.
And the economic unit values, we hadn't got the budget to do bespoke valuation, so the economic unit values would all be transferable, as long as you paid attention to the context. And they're all in the long report. So on the Natural England website is the glossy short summary report with nice pictures, and then for those who are keen on the detail is the long report, which will give you the full detail of the methodology.
Okay, just there's a couple of questions about the availability of slides after the webinar. I think they will be available, and we could perhaps also, for ease of, we could put some of the links to the report and key databases for easy access for everybody. There's also a set of questions about the users of the reports for decision making, both within Natural England, well, for the nature reserves, but beyond nature reserves, but also how you think this kind of approach and this particular report could help the farming community as well.
Oh, I don't know about the farming community. I'll talk about within Natural England. I think, to be honest, we did this in order to do an account rather than to meet a very clearly specified need. So it was an experiment. But we found that when we've done this, that the uses have popped up. So we did another piece of work, which I've not talked about today, which was a more detailed experiment on specific NNRs. And the data we produced there was useful for making funding cases. and I think what we've produced here will be useful in comprehensive spending review, although we didn't design it for that purpose.
I think in terms of farmers, an accounting-based approach, you know, on one level it seems quite attractive. This did take us quite a lot of time, and you know, Kat in particular spent, Kat in particular, you know, spent hours and days and weeks, you know, analysing different sort of data sets, looking at how we can brigade them to say something meaningful, chucking them in the bin when we felt they were just, you know, not helping us anywhere. So you know, I think at the moment it would be quite difficult for farmers to do natural capital accounts very quickly and very straightforwardly in the way that we've done it here. Although, you know, a kind of you know, an ecosystem assessment, if you like, of their farms, where they kind of understand more about, you know, the assets that they've got and the services and benefits it provides, and more of a kind of qualitative approach could be quite useful for them. But you know, yeah, full account would be quite hard work, I think.
Yes, I might add something to that, actually, that there is not, of course, at this level of difficulty and resolution, but I think some of the farms are trying to do accounts. A couple of clients of ours are doing this simply to understand what public goods they provide, and whether or not that could give them sort of headway in the new environmental land management system. And I think that this kind of, and there's lots of comments in the question box as well, that showing the confidence levels in all sorts of estimates and coverage is very helpful in that particular case. And there's praise for you from the listeners on that. Another question, you touched on, I think, spending review, and there was a particular question, or a couple of questions here, to what extent you could use this kind of decisions for attracting funding. Perhaps you did mention the spending review, but if you had any ideas about from other sources than public body, and whether you had any communications with potential sort of blended finance or finance for institutions at all, would be quite interesting to hear, I think.
Yeah, not yet, but I think that's worth exploring. I think the other thing to say is, in terms of using it for decision making, I think there would be another piece of work to do after doing this experiment, which was to get a bit closer to the actual decisions that are being made in terms of managing national nature reserves. But I think in terms of attracting funding, I think the bit that the nature reserve managers found really useful was, I think, something you've already said, Ece, which is about thinking through the public benefits offered. So it would focus, normally the nature reserves would focus very strongly on biodiversity and recreation and education, which is fine. Those are all really important things, but to realise that there are other benefits being provided as well, and to have some sense of the scale is a big step forward. I think people found that very useful.
Okay, another sort of communication related question is whether or not do you know of any similar approaches in the devolved administrations, on the one hand, and I'll give you some time to think for this, but how do you feel about the overhaul by IPBES of ecosystem service categories into nature contributions to people? Is this helpful or not? So 2 questions in one.
You can answer this.
All right, thanks. So on the IPBES side, this is my personal view, having worked on a kind of national level and also working directly with landowners and others. You know, I think the reason IPBES has taken the approach that they've taken, which I think is, you know, is because that's what resonates with the with the groups of people who are involved in that program, and and some of their categories have come out of different countries who have different cultural perspectives on the natural environment and the way they interact with it. And so my perspective is that you use the terminology that communicates with the decision makers or communities that you are working with. So over the years, people have talked to me about having a standardized set of ecosystem services, and we do to some extent. We can use CICES, or there's a set in the National Ecosystem Assessment. But when you actually go away and work with a whole range of decision makers, they might articulate some of those services and benefits in different ways, and you have to be sympathetic to that, because they're the people we're trying to work with. So I guess what I'm saying is it's horses for courses. It's important that you communicate with the people that you're working with, and that therefore you articulate your typologies in ways that resonate with them.
Anything on the devolved administrations? Do you know?
Well, I would say there may be exceptions, but in general, the devolved administrations don't seem to have picked up on natural capital accounting with the same enthusiasm that we have in England. But I think there is stuff to learn. So I think some of the approaches in Wales around joint governance across public institutions, for example, provide a platform where strategic decision making around natural capital could actually feed into decision making. So I think this is a very useful conversation to have with devolved administrations, but we are approaching things from a different perspective.
We did talk to, we have talked to SNH about their Scottish Natural Capital Index as well. So we discussed with their economists, the range of indicators that they've been using, the pros and cons of their work. And, that was one of the key bits of work that we had a look at when we were doing our step back systematic review of the natural capital indicators that I described earlier in the presentation.
Excellent. So part of the we were saying part of the communication is to be transparent about the confidence levels. There are a couple of questions on that. One is that when your confidence level is low on your estimates, are you able to say whether what you estimated likely to be an under or overestimate? And someone asks water not being estimated or being low might need some explanation, and if you could offer any on that.
So I'll take the first one. So the first one is, it depends where so the estimates we've offered are in the middle of the range. And I've done that on purpose because it's very common in environmental economics for people to take what they call a conservative approach, which is they understand the full range of the uncertainty, but what they offer is the bottom end of the range. And then what they say is it's at least that. And that, I can understand why people do that, because it gives you a number that sounds more confident, and perhaps that's helpful in terms of taking into decision. But if we'd done that, we'd be presenting very low values, and I think we'd be selling the NNRs short. So I've preferred to give a number which I think is in the middle, and therefore our confidence estimate goes either way, up or down from there. Ruth, do you want to pick up on the water one?
Yeah, I think this is about the contribution that the national nature reserves make in of themselves. And so if you look at the suite, that map I showed about our national nature reserves that are included, they're all over the country. They don't tend to be based on catchments. They definitely contribute something, but we didn't feel that they were, a high contribution to water quality particular or other attributes of water because of their size, their position and so on. So it's based on expert opinion and understanding of those particular national nature reserves included. So it's not a reflection on the natural environment and its contribution, it's specifically around these sites.
Okay, and there's a question as to how you think we could take the biodiversity assessment forward, whether it be evaluation or something else, because we're always stumbling upon that and we don't seem to be moving forward really. How can we value biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the key bit about the biodiversity, is capturing something around the quality of our assets. So, all those things, that we're interested in, the quality of the assets, relate to the biodiversity, but also the structure and functioning of the ecosystems and their ability to provide services into the future. So, part of the issue around us being unable to value biodiversity, we've tried to address by saying something about the quality of our assets, which includes attributes of biodiversity and ecosystems within it. So it's more comprehensive. So that was the approach that we've tried to take here.
So yeah, and as listeners on the call will know well, there are bits of biodiversity that could be valued, and there are different ways of doing it. So you could potentially come up with some values for some of the charismatic biodiversity on the site. And if you did that, that would be okay, as long as you were clear that that was partial. So I suppose what Ruth's saying there is that we're keen to have biodiversity recognised at both ends of the logic chain, both as a final benefit and actually why people visit NNRs, but also as a key part of the system that produces the rest of the benefits.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the critical thing is, these are complex systems, aren't they? I don't think I've said that enough in the presentation. That in one of Ece's slide early on, she talked about the natural capital approach, taking more of a systems approach, and it's that comprehensive understanding of the system and its ability to provide services, benefits, and values that we're trying to kind of present in a more comprehensive way in this approach. But there's still more work to be done.
And do you have any plans to repeat this account in coming years, and perhaps testing the effect of different ways of managing land? Because there's a comment here saying you spoke about the asset value of land can change if the management, say, changing heavily grazed mown grassland to a more floristic value, meet the pollinator strategy. Do you have any plans to run it under different management options or future changes?
So on the repeating thing, with what we've agreed with Natural England, it doesn't make sense to repeat it sooner than 4 years. And the reason for that is that lots of the indicators that we're reliant on are not updated annually. And so if we did it next year, we'd get a very similar result for many of the things. And similarly, and we hope to improve on this, but until we improve our data collection, then some of the economic value results would be quite similar too. On the management thing, I'm not convinced. I think you'd need to do that on a lower scale, focusing on specific NNRs. And I'm not convinced that what we're doing is, well, is it sensitive enough to pick that up? You'd have to be making a massive change across all of the NNRs to start picking it up with this kind of tool, I suspect.
I mean, for me, going back to the communication piece, I think some of the, so this has been presented to subset of Natural England's board who've looked at it, and it's going to sit alongside our accounts. I think there's something for me about looking at the asset quality as well, and thinking about investments, increasing investments we might want to make in our national nature reserves, and hopefully if we did that, we would see there would be sufficient sensitivity to see improvements across some of those quality attributes. Whether or not that would work its way through to the values, I'm not sure, but you might see some there. Well, I would hope we would.
Mm-hmm. Some scenario analysis as you get more interest in the approach would, I think, be helpful for specific decision makers. There is a request for some of your future work here. A couple of people said whether you could produce a guide for catchment partnerships, conservation groups, rivers and wildlife trusts, etc., geared towards supporting funding applications using this evidence. There is a gap. I've read the wording from Lucy Schuker, but I think there was somebody else who made that point. I can't find it in the list now. So there's a request for you. I don't know whether there's a plan to do that.
Well, there's something related to that. We've using the indicator work that that I talked about in this. We have this in the previous financial year, we contracted West Country Rivers Trust to work with us to produce a natural capital atlas. So, you know, some of those maps that you saw earlier are kind of a sort of bigger version of that across the whole of England. So we're producing that kind of atlas, and then this current year we're looking at cutting those into smaller parts of England. So the bit about trying to describe how different places are providing different has different basic quality and are providing different services, you know, we'll have that more in a map-based form. That's, you know, that's not for accounts, but is something to, you know, that may help with that portfolio. And we're also trying to pull together, aren't we, Tim, some guidance and signposting, if you like, to a range of these kind of tools and evidence-based products that we've been producing over the years to help with decision making over this current year as well. So that may help too, although it doesn't directly answer the request, so we can take that away.
And we'd like to do an account on an area basis as well, using a similar methodology. But we haven't started with that one yet, so we can't point you to it.
Excellent. So there is a final question, and then there's an comment that I will also read out. The question is that if the overall value had come out less than the cost, what would you have done next?
Just exactly what we've done so far, because we've made so clear. I've been so spelling out so clearly that what we're looking at with those numbers at the end is such a partial estimate of the benefits that NNRs provide. If the number had come out less than the apparent cost, that would have been fine with me. I wouldn't have been surprised, because the biggest benefits, I think, we're either not capturing or only partially capturing.
And anything is bigger than zero. That's my attitude to these things.
Yes.
Cool. So when we were talking about the devolved administrations and what was happening there, Alistair McVitie from Scotland is online, and he said that there is. Oh, sorry, where am I looking? Yes, SNH is currently is doing some work on natural capital accounts for the lands that they manage. In fact, eftec is helping them with that. Thank you, Alistair, for the reminder. And the Scottish Government has published ONS national level natural capital accounts for Scotland, and ongoing work on accounting at varying scales exist. So maybe we should also do a webinar with colleagues in Scotland. It will be very interesting. So we're almost out of time, but is there any closing remarks you'd like to make, Tim and Ruth?
No, other than thank you for dialing in.
Yeah, well, the other thing. Go on, Tim, sorry.
I was going to say, pointing to the work, well, hopefully we'll put the link, but to go through to look at both this report, but also the underpinning indicators report, which we published back in September.
And all I was going to say was thank you for dialing in, but any further comments or thoughts afterwards, feel free to contact us.
Excellent. Thank you. It leaves me to say thank you for everyone to dialing in and your questions. As I said, we will we will share the recording of this webinar, the slides, and also the links as much as we can. And I just want to remind you all on we have our final annual conference coming up on 28th, 29th of October in London, and you could hear of all our findings from all our research projects, but also others' work similar to the topic that we covered today. So stay in touch with the network, and hopefully we'll carry on in some shape or form after next year, March, and we make it all up to us all to make the network survive. So hopefully you will stay in touch. Thank you, everyone. I will close the webinar now, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.